Snow falls silently over a forgotten valley, where crumbling stone walls peek from beneath drifts of white. These ruins are the bones of villages that once thrived, communities that dared to endure winters so long and merciless they might have erased weaker peoples from history. Yet here, in the silence, lies proof of resilience, of designs and decisions so subtle they could vanish into obscurity, yet so profound they sustained entire generations. To uncover these hidden strategies is not merely to peer into architecture or artifacts, but to enter the minds of our ancestors who confronted nature's coldest fury and chose not only survival, but continuity. Before we descend deeper into this frozen story, I invite you to walk alongside me through the past. If you find yourself drawn into these hidden worlds and their echoes of endurance, I ask you to lend support, like, share, and subscribe, so that these stories, like the villages themselves, are not lost to the snow. The first sound is silence. A silence so deep it seems to press against the skin like another layer of frost. Imagine standing at the edge of a valley blanketed in snow, the outlines of forgotten structures rising from beneath the drifts like the ribs of an ancient beast. The wind does not whistle here. It drags, heavy and low, pulling at the edges of memory. In this place, every sound has weight, every footprint sinks deep into the white, and every breath carries the threat of freezing before it leaves your lips. Such was the world of our ancestors when winter descended without mercy, stretching not for weeks, but for months that bled into seasons where survival was not assumed but fought for with every heartbeat. The people who lived here did not have the luxury of error. The cold did not forgive missteps, nor did it wait for second chances. A poorly built wall, a weak roof, a food store left unprotected. Any failure could echo through the village like a death knell, and yet they endured. Beneath the veil of snow, behind walls that now crumble into ruin, they crafted designs so intimate with their environment that each detail seems less like invention and more like a conversation with the land itself. It was a dialogue, written in stone and timber, where the answers to survival were whispered, not in words, but in the creak of rafters and the crackle of hidden embers. The silence of snow was deceptive. Beneath it pulsed the hidden labor of a community at war with the season. Their days began in darkness, when the sun barely clawed its way above the horizon, a weak and distant glow that gave little warmth. The villagers rose with it nonetheless, stirring embers to life, sweeping frost from thresholds, and stepping into a world where every task was an act of defiance. Water had to be broken from ice, food dug from hidden caches, roofs swept to prevent collapse. Each action was bound with the knowledge that hesitation meant hunger, and hunger in this world meant death. Stone was their first ally. The walls they raised were not crude barriers, but careful constructions angled to break the wind, thick enough to store the day's fragile heat, and yet placed with gaps that allowed smoke and stale air to drift away. To stand within those walls in the heart of winter was to feel a fragile pocket of life carved from the void. And still, the cold pressed in. It seeped through cracks, it slithered beneath thresholds, it curled around ankles as families huddled closer together, wrapped in furs and silence, their lives lit by the faint orange flicker of fire. But fire, too, was never simple. A flame was not merely warmth, it was survival incarnate, a force of nature bound to their will yet never fully controlled. The silence of winter was often broken by the rasp of flint, the cough of smoke, the sigh of kindling catching at last. A hearth was more than the center of a home. It was the heart of the village itself. From it, warmth spread outward, threading through the veins of each dwelling, linking families to one another through a common struggle. Without it, the cold would swallow all. With it, they endured nights that seemed endless, where time itself slowed, and each hour was counted in the soft hiss of logs burning to ash. Yet fire needed fuel, and fuel was never endless. In this world, every spark was precious. Imagine the desperate calculations made at the start of each winter. How many logs were cut, how much brush was gathered, how much could be spared. Every family knew that their survival was measured not just in flames, but in foresight. Too much burned too soon, and the cold would claim them before spring. Too little, and the dark would seep into their bones until even flame could not drive it away. To manage fire was to manage life itself, and this unspoken equation governed every household. The silence of snow was filled with these unvoiced decisions. A family might choose to close off half their home, sealing rooms in shadow to conserve heat. They might huddle in one corner, their breath clouding in the dim air, listening to the roof creak beneath the weight of snow. Outside, the village seemed motionless, the paths between homes lost beneath drifts, the well frozen solid, the fields buried in silence. But inside, the human will pulsed like a hidden current. Every flick of an ember, every patch of fur pulled tighter, every whispered lullaby to a restless child, carrying the same meaning. We endure. There were no guarantees. A harsh storm could sweep through and collapse roofs despite their strength. Illness could spread quickly in such tight quarters, carried by the very closeness that gave warmth. A hunter could vanish into the snow and never return. And yet, generation after generation, they remained. Something in these designs, these rituals of preparation, gave enough advantage to tip the balance toward survival. And so the silence of snow became not just a threat, but a canvas upon which resilience was written. Look closer, and you might see how even the placement of dwellings spoke of intent. Homes were not scattered, but clustered, walls angled to shield one another, forming pockets where wind swirled less fiercely. Pathways between them were dug deliberately, compacted by countless footsteps, so that when storms came, villagers could still find one another, still carry wood or food across the drifts. In this way, even the architecture of the village became an organism, a living structure where each home supported the others, where the survival of one meant the survival of all. And through all of this, silence was the constant companion. A silence broken not by bird song or rushing water, but by the muffled crack of branches snapping under frost, the groan of ice shifting in the river, or the distant, eerie howl of wolves that circled at the edges of firelight. In that silence, families told stories, their words rising like sparks into the dark. Tales of ancestors who had survived even greater storms, of spirits who guarded the hearth, of winters so cold that rivers froze to the earth itself. These stories were not idle comforts. They were blueprints of endurance, carried in memory as surely as any design was carved into stone. As the chapter of survival opened with the fall of each snowflake, so too did it close with each dawn survived. To awaken after a night when the wind clawed against the walls was to greet the morning with gratitude. To open the door and see the world wrapped once again in white was to understand that survival was not a single act, but a ritual repeated endlessly, day after day, storm after storm. The silence of snow and stone was never truly empty. It was filled with the hidden songs of endurance, the whispered answers of designs that bound life together against the void. And so, when we walk among the ruins today, when we see nothing but collapsed walls and sunken roofs beneath the frost, we are not simply looking at debris. We are standing in the echoes of voices that refused to be silenced, in the traces of choices that turned fragile human bodies into enduring legacies. Each stone, each timber, each faint outline of a dwelling is a testament that silence can be survived if one listens to the designs hidden within it. From this silence, we move deeper into the heart of their world, to the walls that not only resisted collapse, but breathed life into the coldest months. The ruins tell their secrets slowly. What looks, at first glance, like a mere pile of stones is, upon closer inspection, the skeleton of intention. These walls were not raised randomly, nor were they clumsy attempts to keep the cold at bay. Each stone, each layer of mud and timber carried with it a calculation, a knowledge passed through hands roughened by frost and winters long endured. When we speak of ancient architecture, it is easy to imagine grand monuments, temples that scrape the sky, or fortresses bristling with towers. But here, in these villages hidden beneath snow, the architecture was not meant for awe. It was meant for survival, and in its quiet, enduring way, it was no less remarkable. A wall in such a place was never just a barrier. It was a dialogue with wind, with snow, with the restless breath of the season. Too thin, and the warmth of the hearth would vanish into the night, stolen by invisible drafts. Too thick, and the home became damp and stagnant, a place where fire struggled to breathe and smoke choked the lungs. So they built walls that breathed, stones carefully chosen for their fit, pressed together with mud or clay that could hold, yet allow air to filter slowly through. In summer, this meant a gentle coolness, a place where the heat of the sun was tempered. In winter, it meant a fragile equilibrium, a balance between keeping life inside and allowing the fire at the center to sustain it without suffocating. Imagine a family crouched near such a wall, the fire crackling behind them, frost glazing the stones on the outside. They place their palms against the surface and feel not the cold, but the subtle warmth that seeps outward. Heat does not vanish, but lingers, cradled within the thickness of stone, radiating slowly back into the room long after the last log has burned to ash. This was not coincidence. This was design. They may not have known the science of conduction or insulation, but they knew the language of sensation, of breath fogging in the air, of skin prickling when the wind slipped through a gap too wide. Their walls spoke back to them, and through centuries, they learned to listen. The roofs above were no less vital. A roof that merely covered was useless here, where snow fell not as decoration, but as a relentless burden. To live beneath the wrong design was to live beneath a weapon aimed downward, every flake a soldier in an army that grew heavier by the hour. And so the ancestors shaped their roofs with an understanding that rivals our own engineers. They sloped them steeply, that the weight might slide away. They layered them thickly with reeds or thatch, materials that breathed even as they repelled. Snow piled, yes, but never too long, for the design itself invited it to fall, crashing to the ground before it crushed the life beneath. Yet even here, the roof was not singular in purpose. A poorly vented roof trapped smoke, and smoke was as dangerous as frost. They cut narrow channels, small vents that allowed the black air to drift upward, curling into the night sky. To walk outside the village in winter was to see faint plumes rising from each dwelling, a constellation of survival stitched against the heavens. Each plume meant a family alive, a hearth burning, a roof doing its work. Without them, there would be silence. Without them, there would be death. These structures did more than protect from the weather. They organized life itself. The placement of walls and roofs dictated where families gathered, how they stored food, even how they slept. Picture the interior. Raised platforms of earth near the walls, layered with skins, where children huddled close to their parents. Food hung in woven baskets near the roof beams, safe from damp and from rodents. The fire pit, carved carefully at the center, was lined with stone that could be warmed and later pulled free to heat bedding. In every corner of the dwelling, the architecture shaped behavior. It taught its inhabitants how to live, when to rest, when to wake, when to tend to flame or scrape away snow. It is easy to forget that design in such a world was not optional. It was as crucial as blood. A mistake in a blueprint here was not an inconvenience, but a death sentence. And so, generation by generation, these structures evolved. Some villages learned to dig their floors deep into the earth, harnessing the soil itself as insulation, turning homes into half-buried sanctuaries. Others lifted beams higher, creating lofts where smoke could gather and warm the upper air before drifting away. The details shifted, but the essence remained. Every stone, every beam, every thatch chosen with the singular purpose of making life possible when the world outside wanted nothing more than to extinguish it. To walk among these ruins today is to feel the ghost of that careful balance. Stones fallen and scattered still hint at walls once thick enough to trap heat. Depressions in the earth still mark where fire pits once glowed. Charcoal fragments whisper of logs carried from distant woods, split by tired hands, arranged carefully to last the night. And above, though the roofs are long gone, the angles of surviving posts show the slope of survival. Lines drawn not in ink, but in timber and will. There was artistry here, though it was not for beauty. A kind of beauty nonetheless emerged, the beauty of efficiency, of endurance. To see a home that has survived centuries is to glimpse a perfection wrought not from luxury, but from necessity. The walls still stand because they were built to outlast storms. The stones still fit because hands once placed them with knowledge carried not in books, but in memory and habit. Their designs were not recorded in diagrams, but in repetition, in each child watching their elders set stone upon stone, learning through observation what no parchment could contain. But perhaps the most striking truth is that these walls and roofs were never separate from the people who raised them. They were living things, extensions of the body, reflections of the mind. When storms raged, families pressed closer to the walls, listening to them groan, trusting them to hold. When snow collapsed from the roof in a sudden crash, hearts leapt, but relief followed, knowing the danger had passed. The home was not shelter alone. It was companion, protector, almost kin. In its stones and timbers, it carried the heartbeat of the village. Even now, when the walls lie broken and the roofs long rotted, one can still imagine the breath of life within them, the laughter of children echoing against stone, the sigh of a mother watching snow drift through a narrow vent, the low voices of elders trading stories while wind clawed at the eaves. These are not dead ruins. They are bones that once held flesh, skeletons of warmth and ingenuity, fragments of a dialogue between humanity and the merciless season. From walls that breathed and roofs that held, the village turned inward, toward the fire that not only warmed their bodies, but defined their very sense of community. The flame was not simply part of the design. It was the design's reason. And to understand their survival fully, we must step closer to that glow, to the fire at the heart of the village. Step closer now, into the circle of orange light. The wind dies here, at least for a moment, beaten back by the glow that flickers against stone walls and timber beams. Fire is not a detail in the story of these villages. It is the story. The flame was not just a tool, not just a means of warming frozen flesh. It was the axis around which survival turned, the heartbeat of every home, the living symbol of endurance in the face of endless cold. To understand the people of these winters, you must first understand what it meant to tend a fire. The hearth was more than a pit of stone. It was carved with care, often dug slightly below the floor to protect the embers from stray drafts. Around it, stones absorbed heat, holding it long after the flames sank into coals. Ashes were never thrown away without thought. They were spread carefully to shield embers, to keep them alive until morning. The knowledge of how to coax a fire from embers was passed down as sacred inheritance, a lesson every child learned as surely as they learned to walk. There were no luxuries here. If the fire died in the depth of winter, a family could be gone by dawn. Picture a night when the storm outside howls so loudly it shakes the beams above. Snow hammers the roof, piling in drifts that groan against the rafters. Inside, a family gathers close around the fire. Shadows dance against the walls, their shapes twisting like spirits, their voices hushed as if the dark itself might overhear. The youngest stirs the logs with a stick, coaxing the flame higher, while the elder of the house sits watchful, guarding every flicker as though guarding the family's very breath. Outside, the cold roars. Inside, the fire whispers, a fragile balance between despair and survival. The fire was never just practical. It carried with it a gravity of meaning. Around it, stories were told, myths repeated, wisdom passed down. Children grew up staring into its embers, listening to voices that blended memory with imagination, binding the present to the past. Some tales spoke of great winters when the fire itself was said to be a gift from divine hands, a spirit captured in wood and stone. Others whispered that each hearth was guarded by unseen ancestors, their breath rising with the smoke, their presence lingering in the warmth. Whether fact or myth, these stories infused every spark with reverence. Fire was survival, but it was also identity. The hearth was also law. Its flame dictated the rhythm of the household. At dawn, someone must wake before the rest to stir it, to feed it before it sank into cold gray ash. During the day, wood must be gathered, dried, and stacked, a constant labor, for the hunger of the fire was relentless. At night, the flame must be banked carefully, neither too strong to devour the fuel too quickly, nor too weak to fade before morning. In every choice, discipline was required, and in that discipline, the village found order. A family who mismanaged their fire endangered not only themselves, but sometimes their neighbors, for fire was both salvation and threat. Too wild, it could leap to roof beams, turning a home into an inferno that spread through clustered dwellings. Too weak, it could leave the family vulnerable, forcing others to share their dwindling fuel. Thus, the flame bound not just the house, but the entire village in shared responsibility, and yet the fire was more than an obligation. It was communion. To sit together in the circle of warmth was to be reminded that they were not alone. Hands reached toward it, faces turned toward its glow, voices softened in its presence. Even strangers, travelers taken in during storms, became part of this circle, their humanity acknowledged in the simple act of sharing flame. In the heart of winter, bonds of kinship and trust were not forged in grand feasts or ceremonies, but in the quiet act of warming one another by the same fire. The architecture of the village reflected this centrality. Homes were not designed around private corners, but around the hearth. The fire pit was the axis, the anchor, the reason the structure existed at all. Around it, life spiraled outward. The sleeping areas arranged close enough to feel its warmth, the storage spaces set apart, but within reach, the roof vent cut deliberately above it to carry smoke skyward. Step into any dwelling, and your eyes would find the fire first. It was orientation, gravity, the point to which everything else deferred. Fire shaped the senses as well. The smell of smoke lingered on every garment, woven into hair and skin. The sound of crackling wood became the lullaby of winter nights. Eyes adjusted to the dance of light and shadow, learning to read meaning in the shift of embers or the sudden pop of sap bursting in the flame. To live in such a world was to see through firelight, to dream with its flicker etched into the imagination. When spring finally returned and the sun grew stronger, many must have felt its warmth not as liberation, but as a pale echo of the greater warmth they had tended themselves through the long night of winter. There is something almost paradoxical in the fire's presence. It was fragile, a breath of wind, a lapse in attention, and it could vanish. Yet it was also eternal, passed down from ember to ember, season to season, generation to generation. In this way, the fire was immortal, so long as hands remembered to tend it. A flame lit by a child today might trace its ancestry back through countless winters, a lineage of sparks stretching into forgotten ages. To think of it this way is to realize that the fire was not just fuel, but memory itself. A thread of continuity binding the living to the dead, the present to the past. But always there was risk. Fire gave life, but it could take it too. A stray ember could catch in dried thatch. A spark carried by the wind could leap to a neighbor's roof. Villages told stories of fires that raged out of control, consuming everything in their path until nothing remained but blackened ruins on white snow. These stories were cautionary tales, but also warnings encoded in myth. Treat the fire with reverence, never arrogance. It was not yours to command, only yours to tend. To stand in one of these homes now, to imagine the hearth glowing once more, is to feel something profoundly human. In the silence of ruins, one can almost hear the crackle of logs, the murmur of voices, the soft breathing of children asleep by the embers. The fire is gone. The stones are cold, but the memory of its presence lingers in every corner. For without it, there would be no story, no village, no survival at all. From the fire, we move outward into the realm of whispers and shadows, into the stories and myths that grew like frost upon the edges of reality. For while the walls and roofs, the stone and flame protected the body, it was the myths that protected the mind. Legends carried through frost that gave shape to endurance when the nights grew too long and the silence too deep. The fire's glow was not only warmth but a stage, and in its light, the unseen became present. When the nights stretched long and the snow pressed close against the walls, stories took on a weight greater than food or fuel. They were not idle entertainment. They were survival of a different kind. A shield against despair, a way of filling the silence so it did not consume the mind. As bodies huddled together for warmth, words were woven into the air, curling upward with the smoke, carried into memory like sparks drifting into the dark. Each story was a fragment of the past, yet none belonged entirely to history. They lived in that strange space between fact and faith, where the exact details blurred, but the truth of endurance remained. Elders would speak of winters so terrible that rivers froze to the earth itself, and only villages with the strongest fires and the wisest hearts endured. Children were told that each flame carried within it the breath of ancestors, that when they stared into the hearth, they were looking not just at light, but at lineage. Fire was survival, yes, but it was also the visible thread connecting the living to the dead. The myths were filled with spirits who walked unseen among the snowdrifts, guardians or terrors, depending on the choices of the people. Some spoke of a figure who lingered in the white fields, the frost mother, who cradled those too weak to survive and carried them gently into silence. Others told of a wolf made of smoke, whose howl was heard only on nights when the wind cut deepest, warning families to guard their hearths well. To modern ears, these may sound like invention, but to those who lived with death always crouching just outside the door, such stories were not flights of imagination. They were explanations, reminders, and warnings dressed in the garments of myth. In this way, architecture and story were inseparable. A roof beam that creaked in the storm was not simply timber under strain. It was the voice of the house spirit, reminding the family to tend their fire. A vent in the roof that let smoke curl upward was said to be a doorway for ancestral breath, allowing the dead to bless the living with warmth. Even the clustered walls of the village had their stories. Some said they were arranged in the shape of a great animal whose body sheltered the people within. Whether one believed the literal truth mattered less than the sense it gave. The feeling that survival was not only a matter of stone and fire, but of belonging to a story larger than oneself. For the young, these tales became maps of behavior. A child taught that the Frost Mother claimed those who wandered too far into the drifts would think twice before straying from the safety of the paths. A hunter who believed the smoke wolf watched his fire might tend his fuel more carefully, never letting it dwindle too low. Myth was memory encoded in narrative, a way of carrying wisdom when parchment and ink were far beyond reach. The words themselves became as vital as any tool, as necessary as any stored cache of grain. It is tempting now, centuries later, to dismiss such beliefs as superstition, but to do so is to miss their power. For when the darkness was absolute, when the cold seeped into bone and hope seemed fragile, these stories provided continuity. They transformed suffering into narrative, chaos into order. A death in the village was not senseless. It was the frost mother's embrace. A storm that tore at roofs was not meaningless cruelty, but the smoke wolf testing their strength. In this way, the unbearable became bearable. The myths carried them through frost because they gave meaning to endurance. Archaeology cannot recover every word of these stories, but the evidence is there in patterns left behind. Symbols carved into stones, spirals that may have represented smoke or wind, circles echoing the hearth's glow. Graves aligned near the village suggest that the dead were not cast aside but kept close, their presence woven into the daily life of the living. The arrangement of objects, charms of bone, small carvings of animals, hints at rituals tied to fire and winter. To look at these fragments is to glimpse not just survival, but belief made tangible, and belief mattered. For the human spirit is as vulnerable as the body, and in some winters, perhaps more so. Hunger gnaws, cold weakens, but despair can hollow out a soul long before the body gives way. It was in these moments that myth became most crucial. A whispered story could ignite resilience as surely as kindling sparked flame. A song passed from mother to child, sung softly against the crackle of fire, could carry them through another night, another storm. In the world of ice and silence, such intangible things were as real as the walls and roofs that held them. These myths also traveled. When one village met another in the thaw of spring, their tales mingled, shaping and reshaping into shared traditions. The frost mother might become a frost father elsewhere. The smoke wolf might blend with tales of wandering spirits in the woods. Each retelling was not a corruption, but an adaptation, proof that survival itself required flexibility. Myths, like fire, were passed hand to hand, ember to ember, keeping alive what could not be captured by stone alone. Even now, echoes of these stories linger in folklore carried down through centuries. Tales of hearth spirits, of protective ancestors, of beasts whose cries foreshadow storms. These are not mere curiosities. They are faint memories of the survival strategies of villages long gone. They remind us that humans have always sought to frame the unknown, to give voice to the silence that threatens to consume. Myths, then, were not distractions from reality, but part of reality itself, another form of architecture, invisible yet essential. And so, as the fire warmed their bodies, the stories warmed their spirits. The two were inseparable. The hearth was both physical and symbolic, flame and fable entwined. The smoke that curled upward carried not only heat, but words, shaping the invisible bonds of community and belief. Without the myths, the winters might still have been endured, but they wouldn't have been understood. With them, endurance became more than survival. It became meaning. From here, our gaze must turn outward, beyond the circle of firelight, into the greater architecture of survival that was not written in stone or told in story alone. For alongside walls and flames, alongside myths and legends, another structure existed. A living design woven from cooperation, trust, and the invisible threads of community. Survival in the frozen world was never the work of one pair of hands. A single family, left alone, could endure for a time, but the winters would eventually claim them. Food would run out, illness would strike, or an accident would leave them helpless. What gave these villages their power to endure was not only stone, roof, or fire. It was the invisible web binding people together, the agreements spoken and unspoken, the labor shared, the burdens carried across shoulders not their own. This was the true architecture of survival, a community built from trust as sturdy as any wall. In the heart of winter, when the snow lay thick and fields slept beneath ice, the individual tasks of survival blurred into collective ones. A hunter's success was not his alone. The meat he carried back fed not only his household, but often the neighbors who had helped mend his tools or cared for his children in his absence. When a roof threatened collapse under the weight of snow, it was not the family beneath it who bore the danger alone. Neighbors arrived with poles and hands to push the weight free, shouting encouragement over the storm because they knew tomorrow it might be their own roof sagging. Survival was a shared currency, and the cost of selfishness was more than shame. It was death, for to isolate oneself was to weaken the entire chain. This communal bond was not romantic. It was pragmatic. They understood with a clarity we often forget that endurance demanded interdependence. The web was woven of necessity, but it deepened into culture. Over time, the obligations of cooperation hardened into traditions. Stories celebrated not only the heroic hunter or the wise elder, but the neighbor who shared food in lean months, the friend who gave fire to relight a hearth gone cold. Children grew up learning that generosity was not optional but required, that the village itself was a living organism, and each person was a cell whose health determined the whole. Food storage revealed this truth most clearly. No matter how careful, one family's cache might falter. Spoiled grain, a failed hunt, a careless oversight. In such cases, others stepped forward. To refuse was unthinkable, not simply because it condemned one family, but because hunger spreads like frost, weakening the bonds that held all together. Archaeologists uncover storage pits that appear larger than one household could reasonably consume, suggesting that food was pooled, guarded, and distributed communally. Each hand placed in the labor of digging, lining, sealing, and filling, for each would one day draw from the same reserve. This sharing extended beyond food and labor to the most intimate experiences of life. Births were not private events but communal celebrations, where midwives and elders gathered to guide new life into the world. Death, too, was not solitary. The village carried grief together, speaking names, tending fires, ensuring the departed were honored so that despair did not gnaw at the living. In these rituals, as in their architecture, the invisible threads of connection strengthened. Alone, a death was unbearable. Together, it became part of the story. Alone, a birth was fragile. Together, it was hope incarnate. Trust was the mortar of this living structure. In a world where resources were scarce and danger constant, betrayal could unravel everything. A stolen log, a hoarded cache, a refusal to share in labor. Such acts carried consequences beyond the immediate. They fractured the web. Oral traditions likely carried tales of those who betrayed trust, who grew selfish in the cold, and how swiftly the village turned against them. To be cast out was the harshest punishment, for exile in winter was a sentence as final as death itself. Thus, trust was not only expected, but enforced, the lifeblood of the village guarded as carefully as the embers of its fire. And yet, within this stern necessity, there was tenderness. Neighbors carried food to the sick, warmed them by borrowed flames, sang songs to ease pain. Elders, too frail to hunt or haul, gave wisdom instead, their value measured not in muscle, but in memory. Children ran errands, carried kindling, learned early that even the smallest hands were part of the whole. These moments, woven into the larger pattern of labor and necessity, gave warmth of another kind, a warmth not from fire, but from fellowship. In the heart of such brutal winters, it may have been this warmth as much as any design of stone or timber that kept despair at bay. The architecture of the village reflected this invisible web. Homes clustered not by accident, but by intention, their walls close enough to form shared corridors against the wind. Communal spaces, larger hearths, shared workshops, central paths, were carved into the design, ensuring that the daily rhythm of life was not isolated, but interlaced. To walk the village paths was to walk the arteries of a living body, where every heartbeat echoed through the whole. It is striking to consider that these villages, often dismissed as primitive, held within them principles that our modern cities often forget. We build walls high and proud, separating lives into boxes, forgetting that survival once depended on erasing such divisions. They built walls thick, yes, but they also built them close. Their roofs sloped not only to shed snow, but to align with neighbors, forming a shared skyline of endurance. Their fires burned separately, yet together formed a constellation, each glow confirming the presence of life in another household. The web of community was tested often. A storm could strip roofs, a disease could sweep through close quarters, hunger could sharpen the edges of generosity. And yet, time and again, these villages endured, proof that the bonds held strong enough to resist collapse. Their designs in stone and wood made life possible, but it was the invisible design of trust and cooperation that made it sustainable. Without the web, the walls would have crumbled into silence far sooner. Even now, walking through ruins, the presence of this web lingers. One can imagine the call of a neighbor at dawn, checking that the fire still lived in another house. The sound of laughter shared over a rare feast in midwinter, when a successful hunt filled bellies and spirits alike. The muffled cries of a child born in the heart of frost, greeted not by silence but by the soft chorus of a village welcoming new life. These echoes cling to the stones, faint but enduring, the memory of a community that survived not because of individual strength, but because of the strength of the whole. And so, as we leave the warmth of community, our path leads us into reflection. For in the ruins of these villages, we glimpse more than survival. We glimpse philosophy, choices that spoke not only to immediate need, but to deeper truths about what it means to be human. Beyond the snow, beyond the fire, beyond the myths and the labor, there lingers a question that carries into our own time. What does endurance teach us about the meaning of life itself? The ruins are quiet now. The snow has long since melted and returned again. The timbers have rotted, the roofs collapsed, and the fires faded to ash, buried beneath centuries of earth. The people who once walked these paths are gone, their names unrecorded, their voices swallowed by time. Yet when we stand among the stones and imagine the weight of winter pressing down, something stirs. We realize that these fragments are not just remnants of lost architecture. They are traces of thought, of choices, of philosophies carved not into parchment or monuments, but into survival itself. The designs of these villages were never accidental. They were not random shelters thrown together in desperation. They were deliberate, refined across generations, built from an understanding that life required more than mere endurance. Each wall was a decision, each roof a conversation with snow, each hearth a philosophy written in flame. What we see today are not simply ruins. They are the remains of an idea, one that continues to echo across centuries. The idea that survival demands harmony with nature, cooperation with others, and reverence for forces greater than ourselves. In their silence, these villages ask us questions. What does it mean to endure? Is survival only the absence of death? Or is it the presence of meaning even in hardship? For these people, survival was never passive. It was active, deliberate, a constant act of defiance against a season that wished to erase them. Yet they did not resist blindly. They shaped their lives with design, not just physical, but spiritual. Their walls did not only hold back the cold, they embodied foresight. Their fires did not only warm their bodies, they carried memory. Their myths did not only distract from hunger, they gave despair a shape that could be faced. Their communities did not only share food, they embodied the truth that no one can endure alone. We often imagine the past as a place of simplicity, but here we see a complexity as rich as our own. These villagers, though they lacked our technologies, grappled with questions we still carry. How do we balance individual need with the common good? How do we create meaning in the face of suffering? How do we leave behind traces that speak to our descendants long after our voices are gone? In the snow and silence, they found answers, not in words written on stone tablets, but in the patterns of their lives. There is humility in this legacy. These villages remind us that survival was not achieved through dominance, but through balance. They did not conquer winter. They endured it by bending with its force, by listening to the land, by shaping their homes and their habits to flow with the season rather than against it. In a world where we often imagine progress as control, here lies a lesson. Sometimes, wisdom is found not in overpowering nature, but in entering into conversation with it. The walls that breathed, the roofs that shed snow, the vents that guided smoke, all were gestures of respect toward the environment, acknowledgments that life thrives not through arrogance, but through understanding. And what of the myths? We may see them as shadows, but they carried truths we cannot dismiss. For in every story of a frost mother or a smoke wolf was an acknowledgement of vulnerability. These people knew they were fragile, and rather than deny it, they clothed it in narrative. They faced death and despair by giving them names, by folding them into the larger fabric of story. In this way, they turned fear into meaning, and meaning into strength. Even now, do we not do the same in different forms? We invent explanations, metaphors, frameworks to face the chaos of our own world. Their myths, then, are not primitive at all. They are profoundly human. The community, too, speaks across time. Their survival was not the tale of solitary heroes, but of collective strength. To live in such winters required surrendering the illusion of independence. Each life depended on the hands of others, and each hand in turn was sustained by the whole. It is easy, in modern times, to imagine ourselves as self-sufficient, to forget the invisible networks that sustain us. But here, in these ruins, we are reminded that the truest architectures of survival is not built of stone or wood, but of trust. The web that held them together was stronger than any wall, and it is perhaps the most enduring design of all. Standing here, centuries later, one feels both distance and kinship. We cannot know their faces, their voices, the exact rhythm of their days. Yet we recognize their choices. We recognize the way they shaped space to protect warmth, the way they told stories to guard against despair, the way they leaned upon one another when storms bore down. These are not alien people from a lost world. They are us, stripped to the essentials, their wisdom written in structures that still whisper through the silence. And so, what do we carry from them? We carry the reminder that design is not only about beauty or power, but about life itself. We carry the lesson that fire, community, and story are as vital as walls and roofs. We carry the truth that survival is never solitary, that it is always a web spun between many lives. And perhaps, most of all, we carry the humility of knowing that endurance requires respect. Respect for the land, for the forces that shape us, for one another, and for the mysteries we cannot name. The snow still falls on these ruins, as it once fell on living villages. The stones are cold, the fires long gone, the myths faded into fragments, but the designs remain, faint yet indelible, carved into the way humanity has learned to endure. To walk here is to walk not only into the past, but into ourselves. To recognize that what allowed them to survive harsh winters is what allows us still to endure the long nights of our own age. The hidden designs are not gone. They are carried in us,